I've tried my best to recreate the shot from Dotes' video. I even opened my window for this one, or my curtains, so anyway, just hope someone appreciates that. Okay, so Dotes made a video called What the Fuck Was Gamergate, A History, and it's a pretty great video. I pretty much agree with everything she says. I just don't necessarily agree with the way she says it. And I know that she, like... Okay, so Dotes presents the history of Gamergate, and I know we're talking about Gamergate in 2021, but it's actually a pretty fun topic to discuss, right? The way Dotes talks about the history of Gamergate is in the framing device of a Hegelian dialectic, right? Where, you know, gamers and feminists are the synthesis, the thesis and antithesis, and then the Gamergate was the inevitable synthesis result. And I know Dotes doesn't actually believe this. This is just a framing device so that you can actually vaguely comprehend what's going on in an incredibly complicated set of scenarios. But I think it's actually very unhelpful. Because the system is so rhizomatic and fucked up that you need to take a look at some of the external factors. And I think one of the things that, and of course this is just a presentation thing. I don't think Dotes doesn't know any of this. Like, I think she is very aware of it and left it out because it was beyond the scope of the video. But it's not beyond the scope of my video, so we're putting it in here. I think it's important to mention. I think it's very important. So there is one thing that I do disagree with Dotes on, which is the idea that gamers at the point of Gamergate were persecuted against by mainstream society. I think this is completely wrong. And Dotes would basically say they weren't persecuted because they were gamers. Gamers just happened to be mostly autistic and ugly men, and autistic and ugly men are persecuted against. But this is where I think she's wrong. That was the case in the 80s and the 90s, but by the late 90s, then the 2000s, and then the mid to late 2000s, the vast majority of gamers were completely normal people. This is the era of Call of Duty we're talking about. This is the era where everyone going over to my next door neighbour to play MW2, who was a complete, normal person, not a fucking autistic. He's literally a model. He's literally a male model. Like, completely normal, socially competent men are playing video games at this point, and not just like competitive online games, shooters, and all this sort of stuff. Gaming is not a tiny niche subculture anymore. Gamers are wide society. Nerd culture is culture at this point. I remember the exact moment I noticed that nerd culture was culture, which is when I saw a conventionally attractive woman in a train station who had a tattoo of the Charizard sprite from Pokemon Yellow. Or was it Charizard or the Charmander? I don't know, I haven't played Pokemon since I was a kid. But one of them, on her shoulder, the sprite in pixel graphics is a tattoo, and I thought, that's a really cool tattoo, and then I thought, hold on a minute, that person doesn't seem like a nerd, that just seems like a completely normal person. Chatting with her boyfriend, by the way. I was like, And this is where Reddit nerd culture was a thing, right? Reddit nerd culture was a thing. In the early 2000s, nerds even had their own fucking fashion subculture called nerd chic, which was like a thing that people talked about in the fashion world. Like zip-up hoodies with graphic tees underneath and jeans. Like, this was a thing, and big rimmed glasses and bowly, slightly emo but shorter than emo haircuts. This was like a whole thing. And then you also have the idea that, well, actually, I'll get to that in a second. But the reason that gamers still thought they were oppressed is, firstly, there was a subset that were oppressed. There was and there still is, there always will be. The super autistic, hardcore of gaming fans, people who are really, really into MMOs, people who are really into speedrunning, people who are really into, like, old school retro gaming, people who are really, there's always going to be that subset in any subculture. You could also apply that to the way that, like, I don't know, everyone watches films, but there's a subset of film watchers who are extremely autistic about cinema. Like, gaming just reached that point where it was no longer a niche subculture. It was barely even a subculture. It was just culture at that point. Remember, like, at this point, video games, by the time Gamergate happened, were a huge thing. They were about as big as the movie industry. They were a few years away from overtaking the movie industry in net profits. this is where I think Dotes completely gets it wrong, that this was a perception that gamers had about themselves, but not actually the reality of the situation. Now, it is true that the majority of the people on 4chan who were on V and talking about video games on 4chan would probably be more likely to fall into the actually oppressed autistic demographic. But the vast majority of gamers didn't actually fall into this. It was another side to the oppression Olympics. And the reason they thought that they were oppressed and the reason they thought that they had life so hard is stemming back to basically marketing tactics from the 80s and 90s. And I think a lot of Gamergate is actually due to marketing, the way video games were marketed. Firstly, video games were marketed exclusively to boys, right? And this is another thing that's important, is that most gamers were, and basically since Nintendo rebooted the market after the video game crash of '83, gamers were children, young male children. That was gamers, right? The vast majority of gamers were young children or teenagers, basically young teenagers, and boys, right? Men, male, the ones with dicks. Not all men have dicks. I just want to make sure I'm not being transphobic here. Not everyone with a dick is a man. Anyway, so that's why, you know, gaming was sort of a boys-only club. Not because of anything inherent in games themselves. Well, man, it developed, it was a spiral. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Games were marketed at boys, so more boys played games, so the game designers and game developers created games that could be more easily marketed towards their main demographic, which was boys, because that's what they'd marketed to before. And it was a snowball effect where you had more and more, you know, girls in skimpy outfits, big guns, military sims, etc., and fewer games targeted at women. But this is a marketing thing, because there is nothing inherently, you know, all of that is social created bullshit. Firstly, the idea that women in skimpy outfits is for men, isn't that a little bit exclusionary to lesbians? There's a whole thing going on there. I don't want to get into it, but basically it was this idea propagated from the 80s, and in movies like Revenge of the Nerds and stuff like that. Was it called Revenge of the Nerds? I don't remember. I've never seen it, but there was a whole thing in the 80s where of appealing to nerds, sort of getting back at the jocks of mainstream society. And because gaming was such a big part of 80s nerd culture, and a lot of people grew up when that was gaming culture, when they grew up into being later teenagers or in their 20s, that's how they just still saw gaming culture, as this sort of nerds versus jocks thing that was completely outdated at that point. Nerds and jocks had already broken down as a distinction, but even if you had the dregs of that, gamers were everywhere. There was nerd gamers, there was jock gamers. There was no... Gaming was culture. It was not a subculture at this point. And the subculture that did exist for gaming was the Reddit subculture, which again was very much normie. Remember, this is the era of like Steve Jobs and super rich people who are nerdy. Being a nerd is now, you know, there was a whole fucking thing about how being a nerd is cool. This was like a whole big deal in culture about this time, or just before it, how being a nerd is cool. And it was a whole thing that even people who wouldn't normally have been nerdy got into nerdy stuff because they wanted to be cool. This is a whole fucking thing. So the idea that gamers were actually discriminated against as a whole class is not true, because the vast majority of gamers weren't autistic nerds. The vast majority of gamers were completely normal, average people, but men, right? And the idea that gamers were discriminated against was very popular because of marketing technique, because of marketing campaigns in the 80s and 90s. Because when you want to make... and another thing about gaming culture is that it is again, because of marketing tactics in the 90s, if you wanted to market to young and teenage boys in the 90s, how did you do it? What was the default approach? Extreme! Everything extreme! Right? So gaming became obsessed with this idea of being extreme and edgy. And even, you know, Doom was a huge deal for being so extreme and edgy. Everything in gaming, Mortal Kombat, extreme and edgy was like the heart of it, because it was all a marketing technique. And people bought into it really seriously. Because they're idiots. Because people are not immune to propaganda. Marketing works. And so then... and this is where it all comes to being genius, right? This is where the genius stuff happens. Then you have the internet. And Dotes talks a lot about how gaming became a thing online where people would discuss games in forums and such like. But what Dotes doesn't mention is AVGN. AVGN is the cause of Gamergate, because AVGN figured out that you could take the extreme marketing tactics of 90s video games, apply them to a character, you know, the angry video game nerd, who's a stereotype of someone who never would really exist, right? And then make really successful and funny YouTube videos where you get excessively angry about video games. And that was so popular that that formed the base of online video game culture. All of online video game culture was based on the formula of man getting overly, ridiculously upset about a video game. And the point of AVGN is that it's inherently funny to do that, because video games are not important. They're not important at all. And so being actually genuinely angry about them is inherently comical and stupid. But people really bought into it because they're idiots, and people, if you show people something ironic, they'll take it seriously, especially on the internet. And so that became the basis of gaming culture, all because of Angry Video Game Nerd. And another thing, this is really, really important, I've only been talking about one side of the debate here, right? I've only been talking about the 4chan side, which was really more the Reddit side. Because remember, 4chan was actually still quite a small... It probably had maybe 1 million average users before Gamergate. Only during Gamergate, when Reddit flooded the site, did 4chan actually become anything bigger than it was. And everyone hated it. After Gamergate ran out of steam, they were like, this was a fucking terrible idea. Now we got all these people that don't know the culture, right? It was... Reddit is a much, much, much bigger site than 4chan, and even Reddit is only a small demographic of the people who are actually playing video games. So most gamers were not really nerds or autistic at all. Only a subset of a subset self-identified as that, and even a bunch of them were pretty much normal people. They were just inspired by AVGN and by the whole culture created originally by the marketing departments of the 90s, that you need to be really angry and extreme about video games because you're a man and video games are somehow manly, right? That was sort of a big part of the culture. But the important thing about AVGN is that the internet killed critics, right? Film criticism and games criticism and all this stuff. Why would you go to Roger Ebert for your film review when you can read Film Crit Hulk do a review and it'll be much funnier? Or when you can go on YouTube and see someone like YMS rip a film to shreds and it's much more entertaining than reading a boring film review? Or, even more interestingly, why not do it democratically? Why not go on Rotten Tomatoes and see what the vast majority of the audience has to say about the film, rather than just placing your trust in some critic? Criticism dies at this time. And so they have to find new ways to fucking keep their businesses afloat, and they do it through clickbait articles, just like everyone else on the internet. But AVGN was actually one of the reasons that this criticism died, because who cares about reviewing modern games when you can see this guy getting really upset at a fucking Atari game and it's the funniest shit you've ever fucking seen? Right? Who cares about someone at a newspaper reviewing a video game? I could just literally look up the Metacritic score of what everyone who's played that game thinks about it and know whether it's good or bad. And there's no need for authority anymore. We've democratized rating systems and reviews. Now, obviously in the real world, this was not really a good idea, because what appeals to the most people would get the best reviews, not what is actually the best, you know. You can't tell if you personally would get the most out of it based on a Metacritic score, because that is really measuring how much it appeals to the lowest common denominator. Whereas with a reviewer, you can actually learn, like, oh, well, this reviewer has a similar taste than me, so if they like it, I'll probably like it. They will give you a more detailed review. They'll say, this will be good for people who like puzzle platformers with this sort of style and who like this game, and you can be like, I'm a person who likes this game, I might like this. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of reasons why this was a mistake, but because of the internet democratizing, you know, AVGN was just some literal guy in his mum's basement who was making video game reviews that were much more popular than anything the mainstream press were putting out, and therefore the mainstream press had to find some way to, they had to find another crowd, because the male demographic that had been previously reading their reviews no longer gave a shit and no longer bought their fucking shit, plus physical media's dying out meant that no one was buying physical magazines, so there was a lot less money in the industry altogether. So that's the first thing. And the other thing that AVGN did is basically invent cringe culture. A big part of the whole Gamergate thing from the side of the gamers, quote unquote, because remember, this is really a tiny subset of gamers who actually gave a shit about this. The one of the main weapons on their side was cringe culture, and I'm actually really surprised Dotes didn't mention this, unless maybe she did mention it and I just wasn't paying attention, which is also quite likely. Which is that on 4chan, everyone's anonymous, no one posts their face. It doesn't happen. No one has a name. If you have a name, you get called a faggot. Everyone hates identity. There's no identity. So you're just a collective. Ironically, the more right-wing site is a far more collective site, whereas the more left-wing sites like Reddit and Tumblr and Twitter encourage individual identity. And this actually goes all the way back to the 70s and the birth of neoliberalism. So you have on the one side a blob of mass of anonymous posters, and on the other side individuals you can individually make fun of, and some of them will look really silly, right? So you just find ones that look really silly and collectively bully them, and they can't do anything about it because they can't find any of you to look individually silly, until eventually they did, and that's how you end up with BreadTube. But for a long time, there was no one that you could find individually silly and bully on the gamer side of things, right? But the Tumblr people made it very easy because they made posts that were for their own community, and they didn't expect people who are outside of their own community, who were outside of the in-jokes and references and theoretical basis behind their posts, would ever really care about them. So, they literally just weren't set up to deal with a crisis like this, whereas 4chan has always been set up to deal with a crisis like this. It's their bread and fucking butter. And because of people like AVGN getting outraged on the internet and laughing at stupid people was very, very popular. This also goes back to the 90s and early 2000s comedy movies and just general comedy culture. It was very much about laughing at stupid people. And so the idea of laughing at stupid people on the internet was already a meme that was just waiting to be born, and it just so happened that the stupid people who got picked up in it were feminists, because, you look like a clown when you have big red hair and, whatever, and also people like hating on women. People are sexist. This is another thing. It's very easy to make fun of women on the internet. It's like the easiest thing you can possibly do is make fun of women on the internet. Take no effort. But, another thing. This is something really interesting that I'm, again, surprised Dotes didn't mention. This isn't necessarily directly related to Gamergate, but what came after it, the whole general anti-SJW movement and MRA movement and incels and all that, is that this was the first social movement created entirely by AI. Right? This entire thing was created because somehow YouTube's algorithm decided that anti-SJW feminist-owned compilations are the world's greatest fucking most profitable thing in the world. And that's how it spread, really. Most people weren't actually going on 4chan. 4chan is still, in the grand scheme of the internet, a very small website. It's not that small anymore. But it's still much smaller than Reddit, and it's still much smaller than, obviously, Twitter is and Tumblr is. Actually, I think these days Tumblr is probably smaller than 4chan because most people have jumped ship. But 4chan was always, especially at the start of Gamergate and, towards the beginning of the anti-SJW stuff, it was a relatively small website, right? It was because, everyone goes on YouTube, though, and YouTube is recommending people these feminist-owned compilations and stuff like that, and, surrounding that, people are referencing 4chan culture, and so as a kid, because you're probably about 13 at this point, because otherwise you wouldn't be bothering to get into arguments on the internet about video games, because you'd be clever enough to not know, or to know that that is a stupid thing to do, and you also probably wouldn't have time, because you're probably, working and stuff like that. So these children and young teenagers who are on YouTube all the time, seeing these videos targeted at them, promoted algorithmically, and, maybe I could get schizo about it and say that this was the algorithm, doing something to preserve itself, but I'm not going to go there, because that might be a little too schizo for the scope of this video. But this basically was entirely created by an algorithm that decided these videos are profitable for the company and promoted it, and that led people into the whole rabbit hole, which is very well documented at this point. Another thing about 4chan is that ever since Anonymous became a thing, ever since the very first Habbo Hotel raids and the pools closed stuff, 4chan has always seen themselves as a social force, right? They pride themselves on weaponized autism. And so, if you give them something to rally against, they really think that they're the most powerful people in the world, and they often will prove themselves correct. You have a lot of people with a lot of resources and no identity to basically pull all of their information together, and they really see themselves as a social force. So when they saw someone who they felt was attacking them, it was very easy to get all of 4chan to rally behind what they saw as fighting back, even though really no one was attacking them. It was all in their fucking heads, and they were just being memed by decades-old marketing tactics. Another thing, the reason they thought that they might have been being attacked is because it's very easy to think feminism is part of the monoculture because of recuperation. If you don't know, recuperation is the process by which capitalism reincorporates or recuperates anything that you can throw at it, basically. Capitalism will eat your rebellion and sell it back to you for $60, that sort of thing. And so during the 80s and late 70s, feminism and other social movements were very popular. Where was I? Sorry. So sometime during the late 70s and 80s, basically you get the idea that you don't have to oppose capitalism to enact social change. You know, stuff like Live Aid. Adam Curtis likes talking about this. I know you've been watching Adam Curtis lately, dotesmite. Now this video is apparently directly addressed to you. I don't know. So there's this idea that you can change society through capitalism by just donating to the right charities and buying things from the right companies. And along with this, feminism is gearing up and getting really successful in its endeavour to empower women. That's basically been the entire goal of feminism, is women have no power in society. Women are fucking, treated like shit by everyone. Men have all the power. We need to empower women. And the best way to do that is to put women in positions of power. But here's something. Women are still human beings. And yeah, I know some of you might be surprised to hear that, but women are in fact still human beings. And when you put a human being in a position of power, they are very likely to no longer want to give up that position of power. And so very rapidly, the more women who gained success in the capitalist system, the less likely they were to support anti-capitalist movements. And also, these women who are in power, they still want to do something good for the world, and especially because when you are seen to be doing something good for the world, that is also very profitable. The presenting an image of progressivism became gradually more and more popular, and this was first of all not in feminism. This was actually first really manifested itself in the environmentalist movement, in the green movement. But over time, all of these, what started as sort of anti-capitalist movements have become recuperated. This is a thing everyone knows. And so companies figured out it's very profitable to seem progressive. And, when you're surrounded by propaganda of various companies advertising how progressive they are, it's very easy to just think, well, clearly progressivism is the cultural mainstream, the hegemony, the hierarchy that rules over me. And so to oppose it is to be the underdog, to be the rebel. And so that's why 4chan really easily latched onto the social struggle, because it's really easy to feel like you're the underdog in that situation because it's a bit nuanced, and 4chan doesn't do nuance. Men don't do nuance in general. So yeah, there's a thing. And where was I going with this? I don't remember. There was something else I wanted to say. Fuck, what was it? It was funny. Hold on, let me pause the video while I think about it. I didn't remember what I was going to say, but I remember something else I was going to say, which is that when I was talking about the death of criticism and, the birth of the sort of Metacritic and YouTube critics and stuff like that, and the death of major publications, this meant there was already a pre-existing hatred of these major corporations who were, selling criticism. There was already a brewing resentment towards them because there was a homegrown alternative which seemed more authentic. And so there was already a big brewing resentment towards these major publications and a sort of suspicion of them before there was objective proof of, poor ethical reasoning and poor journalism in general. The thing is that they hold to completely different standards. If you present yourself as a journalist, then you're held to the standards of a journalist, and most of these games journalists you know, don't meet those standards. In fact, most journalists don't meet those standards. Whereas if you present yourself as a funny gaming YouTuber, no one's holding you to the standards of everything you say has to be objectively true, blah, 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 blah. Like, you know, there's a completely... So there's always... The YouTuber's always going to win. Or no one's going to say, well, Metacritic review doesn't make any... You know, all of this stuff. All of this... There's all this stuff going on. Basically, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that seeing this as a culture war between two opposing sides is reductionist, because really the big picture is always economics. The economics of YouTube as a platform encouraging their AI to promote certain videos. The economics of Twitter as a platform encouraging them to, you know, ban edgy accounts because it's bad for business, bad luck for stockholders when you see, you know, blah, blah, blah. The economics of... games companies in the 90s who were advertising their games in a certain way. The economics of neoliberal capitalism recuperating feminist and other anti-capitalist aesthetics. The economics of journalism, how they needed to make money after the death of print media and the death of the critic. All of these economic aspects actually were really what sparked all of the social stuff. The social stuff was really a response to economic conditions rather than the other way around, which is not fun to think about, because then you realize how beholden we are to economic systems that completely don't give a shit about us. But really a lot of this boils down to economics. This is definitely one of the more fun parts of modern political discourse, is that everyone tries to argue from the position of the underdog, right? Gamergate was the first movement that really proved this is effective. I think that's one of the other cultural things that it did, is that, you know, the Tumblr people saw themselves as fighting against the overarching hierarchy and huge monoculture that is patriarchy and capitalism, although most of them probably didn't see themselves as fighting against capitalism, and you know, traditional game design stuff, like with Depression Quest, all these sorts of things. Whereas 4chan saw the same thing. We're fighting against the capitalist hierarchies of huge journalistic publications with investors, with $1 million investors in main, like, coastal elite towns. We're fighting against, you know, all of this sort of stuff. Like Twitter, giant social platforms which are banning us for free speech. We congregate on 4chan, which is owned by just some dude who just made it in his basement, you know. It's not even profitable. So both sides see themselves as the underdog fighting some grand hierarchy, when in reality they're both just nothing pawns in a grand economic game that is too complicated to be explained with a Hegelian dialectic. You can't even describe it with class war, because there's no class warfare involved. I mean, you could say that the entire thing was a class warfare from the bourgeoisie, but there was bourgeoisie on both sides. Everyone's bourgeoisie in this situation. You can't explain it with fucking Marxism. It doesn't make sense. There's no Hegelianism to be found. Hegelianism? Yeah, there's no Hegelianism to be found here. It's all a mishmash of post-structuralist nonsense. There was definitely something else that I wanted to say, but I've completely forgotten it, so I think I'll just leave the video here. Go watch Dotes' video on Gamergate. It's actually a pretty good history of the material conditions and the history of Gamergate and how it sort of became a thing. It's pretty good. I also believe that a lot of the discourse of Gamergate was manufactured. Like, I literally think that there were people who were really pretending that they believed in something, and half of them didn't actually believe in it, and they were just doing it because it's fun to get angry online about something, and people wanted to feel like they're part of a movement, and Oh, I remember the thing. This is the most important point. Please don't have clicked off the video, because it's the most important point. All of Gamergate boils down to Freudian psychoanalysis. All of Gamergate boils down to fucking Oedipus complex, because boys, when they were kids, were constantly punished by having their mums take their video game consoles away from them. And so all of this generation of young men grew up with a subconscious fear of women taking away their video games. And so then when there was even a perceived threat of women taking away their video games, everyone went fucking crazy because they all had this psychological damage about a authoritarian and a female authority figure taking away their video games. And so this subconscious fucking Oedipal weirdness boiled up in the form of Gamergate. That's what I wanted to say. That was my fucking final point. Aside from economics, it's also Freud.